Let's talk.
Giles Brown.
8 weeks. Looking back, moving forwards, defying the odds is a deeply moving and inspiring memoir that tells the remarkable story of Baroness Young of Hornsey, from her childhood in foster care to becoming one of the first black women in the House of Lords. It's a fascinating book. It's the kind of book that makes you sort of stop and listen and think. And I'm delighted to say that Baroness Young joins me live on the line now. Baroness, good morning to you.
Good morning, Giles, but please call me Lola.
Okay, all right, fine. Whereabouts are you, by the way, today?
I'm in sunny Turnpike Lane.
Ah, you see,
which is North London.
Yeah, we are aware. Our geography isn't that bad. I was just saying off air that I caught a little bit of an interview that you did with the great James O'Brien a little earlier on his podcast. And when I'm doing what's laughingly called research, I'm doing something else. You know, I'm checking my thimble collection or something like that, or putting the spoons in order. But it was one of those situations where I just sort of, because obviously I know of you, but I didn't know this backstory, and it was a real sort of, gave me real pause for thought, to put it mildly, Lola.
In what way?
Well, it's just that, we tend to think that somebody's got a baroness, or that, they're the House of Lords, they're in politics, and you kind of think it's an identity. It's kind of, in a world where we are all told it's the elites and everybody's out after themselves and they all came from the same public schools and they all knew each other since the year whatever and they all had quote unquote happy family backgrounds. It just made me pause because of your background, and also in the nicest possible way, hopefully, that is a world that we have left behind, because you talk about, your parents and your Nigerian heritage, and the fact, and I did an interview with somebody a while back about the way that foster and adoption used to go, and in terms of people, and I mean, not that it was in your case, but people used to make money out of fostering, and I just thought, what an incredible situation it was, because she's 64 years old, your foster mum, wasn't she, and a war widow and a white woman, bringing up a child of African heritage, and I just thought that's a world that hopefully has kind of disappeared in the way that her style and the outrage and the shock, if you like, of bringing up this bringing up a Nigerian child in London. I mean, that was what basically it.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's not the norm, and as you sort of suggest, I don't really look like or sound like the stereotypical member of the House of Lords. So, I'm happy about that, let's say. And that world that you kind of sketched out very clearly there is, it's not the same. Obviously, it's not exactly the same because nothing ever stands still, but there are elements of it that still pertain today, particularly around the care system and what that means for, a child or a young person being in the care system, particularly towards the end, as I described. At the age of 18, you have to leave the care system. They call that now the care cliff. Right. Okay. When you drop off and it's a sort of sink or swim situation. That's right. And what's been fascinating but slightly horrifying for me has been that talking to present day care leavers, the emotional and the sort of practical circumstances that they describe are not a million miles away from what I experienced. Because one of the other things I took away was the fact that, I mean, we'll talk about you personally, but the fact that the care system is a system that works for the people who run the system and not necessarily in the best interests of those who are vulnerable and in the system. I mean, I think actually I'd go even maybe a little bit further, which is that the system doesn't even necessarily work for a lot of people that work in it, because I think most people who work in the system want it to be the best it can be for the children and young people, that for whom they're responsible. But the system, it seems like somehow gets away from us and becomes an end in itself, so that all it does is perpetuate itself and the need for it. And if you think about, particularly for those people who've had a happy, quote unquote, normal childhood, the idea that it's a system, would be really horrifying to people. You don't bring up nurtured, rounded individuals in a system.
And also the thing. Let's talk about the book itself. 8 weeks. Now, the reason it's called 8 weeks was this the time that how old you were when you were? And is it Daisy, the woman who looked after you?
Yes, yeah, right. I was 8 weeks old when I was handed over to Daisy, who, as you said earlier, was in her mid-60s by then. So, people say, "Oh, did you think your life was normal?" And my sort of response to that is it's on two different levels. On one level, that was my norm. And you know what it's like when you're in something, that's your norm, and you don't sort of necessarily think outside of that. But on the other hand, of course, I knew that this white-haired old white lady wasn't my biological mother, but nonetheless, I called her mum, as did all the other children who were with her at the same time as me.
Yeah, you say during parents' nights and stuff like that, and she would rock up to your school. This white hair. The other thing is the fact that you mentioned I suppose because when you're a kid you don't know any better. This is the first experience as a kid, so you can't. Okay, so for example, you can say, okay, well, my mum's a little different. But the main thing, I suppose, was the fact that you had a roof over their head and you were nurtured. And I'm going to use the word love sort of advisedly because it's a different era, isn't it? I mean, now we'd have, Americanization to be part of your journey, as the Americans would say, and it'd be a Hallmark movie. But, this is a woman who's lost her husband during the war. And I know it sounds silly, but I grew up in the 60s and the 70s. Things were different.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you couldn't, feelings, it's almost as if like feelings didn't exist. There was no sort of way of sharing feelings. So you're right to point that out. And in fact, not just her, but, this is early 1950s. So lots of people, particularly in the big cities and elsewhere, had experienced the trauma of the Second World War. And we're now moving into this bright new future, allegedly. So, there must have been a huge amount of emotional and psychological turmoil, which wasn't really addressed because people didn't really think about it in those ways. But you're right, again, to say that, the fact of having a roof over my head, 3 meals a day, and, going to school. And I loved reading. So going to school wasn't a pain for me. I really, really enjoyed that. In fact, the first day I went to my interview at the school, at my primary school, I asked Daisy if I could stay the night there because I was so thrilled at the idea.
But the house itself, you described this wonderful house with, is it sort of several floors high? I mean, this sounds Dickensian. Several floors high and it's various members of her extended family. Are there other members living there? On the third floor there was, Uncle so and so. I mean, it just sounds like, again, like a Hallmark movie sometimes.
There was a television series on at the time called Our House, and I used to think that's what my actual house should be like, because we lived in the basement, Daisy and the other kids lived in the basement. And then, as I like to think of it, her family line is interrupted on the upper ground floor by two, they seemed elderly to me then, two women who lived together on the upper ground floor, who weren't related to anybody as far as I know.
Right. Then
the next floor, Daisy's biological daughter. And then on the floor after that, Daisy's biological daughter and her husband. And then on the floor after that, Daisy's biological granddaughter, her husband, and Daisy's great-grandchildren. So, yes, it went up in generations, which was really interesting and very visual. To me, I can see it as I'm talking about it.
And I also love that thing about, two ladies living together, because there was a lot of that after the war anyway, because there were a lot of men went around. But because my grandmother had friends like that, women who lived together, but, you couldn't mention that word because it wasn't acceptable in the 50s and 60s.
That was another thing that didn't exist then, apparently, allegedly. But what people called them was spinsters.
That's the one, yes.
So it was, and again, I can see them, in the kind of crepey blouse. As you say, it's almost like Dickensian, but not quite. Thankfully, not in the worst aspects of Dickensian Britain.
And your parents, because you knew where you came from. It wasn't a case that because a lot of people would go. And this is the thing as well, because you were fostered, and you said that one of the things you would have one of the aims or one of the things you would have loved to have done at that point was to be adopted. And I'd never thought of this before. I'd never thought of because hey, that's just me. But I never thought about the fact that if you are fostered, what you want as a kid is to be adopted and be accepted as that sort of thing.
Absolutely, because adoption's permanent in kids' minds. Of course, in the majority of times it is, but in comparison to fostering, it's absolutely a permanent thing, and it meant that people had chosen you, and therefore they loved you. And it was this kind of fantasy world that I lived in, part of the fantasy world that I lived in. And interestingly, again, you referred to, there being lots of women who would have been widowed as a result of 2 world wars following on in quick succession. There would also have been a lot of children who were orphaned, I guess. So some of the stories that I read would be about children who got, who were orphans, but whose aunt who lived in the countryside looked after them, or some distant relative came from another country. So, it wasn't entirely made up in my mind, but there was this idea that adoption would be great. And also 1 or 2 of the other children that Daisy looked after did go off and get adopted. So
was this sort of there's a rambunctious banshee of children sort of circulating around the basement area then, basically?
Yeah, but in quite a quiet way. I mean, again, it wasn't like
Fagin's Den. It wasn't Fagin's gang,
right? Like Fagin's Den at all. No. Although one of the children there, he did get into trouble, but I think by today's standards, it was really minor. But every now and then he'd be sent away to a school, what I used to think of as a school for naughty boys.
Yes.
But he wanted to come back to Tottenham Park Road, so he would run away from that home and come and go again and come and go again. But other than that, no, it was stable in the sense that the other 2, so him and another girl, they'd been there since they were babies. So it was stable in a way that some foster homes aren't at all, where you have got lots of children coming and going.
And it must have been stable because you passed your 11 plus. Didn't you? You passed your 11 plus, which is more than I did, right? And then you decided you didn't want to do 11 plus because, and I shall get on my Trotskyist soapbox now and start singing the Internationale, but you decided you didn't think it was right because even though wasn't your best friend going to the grammar school as well, but you thought, I want to go to a school where everybody starts from the same basis.
Yeah, I know. And it's weird because looking back on that seems like a very mature decision to have made at the age of 11 for a girl who was, had these experiences, but it was really a tight little world. So, but that was I think it was a combination of through my reading and through friends that I'd liked. In my class, for some reason, I remember that 11 of us, maybe it wasn't 11, anyway, there are only very few of us in the class actually passed the 11 plus. And I thought, well, my friends who didn't pass, they're still my friends and there's still people I like. So why should we all be separated out in this way? And actually, Parliament Hill School, which is where I went for my secondary school, had been a very early comprehensive school because I think it was in 1964, by which time I'd been there for a couple of years, they were celebrating 10 years of being a comprehensive. So it must have been quite early.
One of the early ones. Your biological parents, because when you get to a certain age, when you get to 40, especially with girls, when you get to 14, well, probably early now, but 14, 15, 16, you're asking questions. You're trying to find out a little bit more about, where you come from, your place in the world. So how was because you say you're never going to know the full story, but you try to get some of the full story, and that can be, now there would be you'd have therapy sessions, you could probably key it on Facebook or social media, but then it's a very different beast. And how did that affect you? And because they were still giving some money, weren't they, for your upkeep?
Yeah, my mother every now and then would give some. And I did, as you mentioned earlier, see them every now and then as well, maybe 3 or 4 times a year on average. And yes, you're right. I wanted, there was a part of me that wanted to know. When I was adult, there's a part of me that wanted to know, and there's a part that didn't want to know. Because what had been sketched out to me, I thought wasn't particularly kind of favourable towards my parents. So, and the way they sort of dealt with me or didn't deal with me. So I was kind of quite ambivalent about that. When I was younger, I think my thoughts were really concentrated on what was happening in the immediate future rather than I wonder what they're doing. And in fact, if I look back now, I was remarkably uncurious for as long as Daisy was alive. And as you may remember in the book, Daisy died when I was 14. So like you say, that was that period. And even then, I don't think I thought, there wasn't a bone in my body that thought I was going to be reunited with my mother or my father. Not at all. There was no way. My fear was that I'd be sent away to a children's home or a home for bad girls, even though I wasn't quite sure what I'd done that was so bad.
So the other thing that struck me as well is that you are an African, British African. Your parents are from Nigeria, being raised by a 60-something-year-old white woman, in this rambunctious house. And my thought was, well, and I'm not going to use the W word because but people are saying, oh, well, you could only really raise a child from a various ethnic group or from a various, and I'm really, really careful I don't fall over my words here, but you can only sort of Nigerian parents can raise Nigerian children. I mean, if you said only white parents can raise white children, we're in a whole different kettle of fish. But it was a case of, look, there's a child and he's looking after. It doesn't matter if they're black, white, green, or whatever. Let's look after this child, which perhaps these days we don't have so much of.
Well, I think, this whole argument, and I think you're right not to be pulled into the, naming these different words and different sort of factions, as it were, because to my mind, it's always reduced to something that is overly simplistic, by which I mean, it's like you characterised it. And I'll say, that black children should only be raised by black foster parents or black adoptive parents or mixed heritage. If they're mixed heritage, they should go into such and such family. And as you say, the looking at it sort of, white people should only look after white people becomes a little bit different. And that's what should give us the clue as to why this is much more complex than simply saying this goes with this and that goes with that. In my particular circumstances, there were very few, well, I don't think there would have been any sort of registered black or Nigerian heritage foster parents. We're talking about the early 1950s. And to me, today, it's not as simple as saying, if you're black, you have to be brought up by a black family. There are lots of complexities and ins and outs that mean that you have to my mind, you have to look at the context. You have to look at who, where, why, how, and what the fit is. So it's much more complicated. And of course, class comes into it too, sometimes in so very interesting but quite disturbing ways in my mind.
I mean, here's the thing, and we are at the middle of, we are in a very interesting period of history, to put it mildly, with people saying, oh, well, we don't want these people coming over. They're not like us. The whole summer of idiocy that we went through over, wherever we are. We in Spain, we've got Vox in this question as well. And you just think, hang on a second. It wasn't the vision that you're painting of 60s and 50s and 40s Britain isn't exactly what happened with, white, majority of white people, but also, and I can hear people shouting woke at the whilst as I speak. But basically, the thing that we should recognise and we should salute is there are decent human beings out there who will do stuff, and it didn't even register with somebody like Daisy, who probably hadn't had come into that much contact pre-war with that world. But the overriding feeling here is of decent human beings doing the right thing, no matter where you come from.
Yeah, this is one of the things that, as I say, quite overcomplicates the whole sort of set of arguments, because in the end, as you said, look, Daisy was brought up in an era when I was brought up in an era when they're still teaching about the empire. Yeah. So that would have been part of her history, part of her makeup, if you like. And curiously, because of her experience, I think, with the kinds of West Africans that she encountered, she actually thought that Africans were more intelligent than white people, because like my father, an uncle, an aunt, all of these people were university educated, whereas none of, people were still leaving school at 14 or 15 in those days. Yeah. So that was a very educated class. But she had some of her prejudices, but she also spotted some of the instances where I was being discriminated against. And so, this kind of mixture, although she didn't understand things like African-American civil rights, hardly anybody in Britain did at the time. Yeah. And the key thing for me is that, and this is what I found out when I found my records, was that she was looking after me from her own funds, and in very, very much in opposition was her biological daughter, because her biological daughter felt that she should be using what little money she had to support her own, naturally related relatives, rather than this black girl whose parents had left her behind. Yeah,
and literally, because they went back to Nigeria, didn't they?
They did. They went their separate ways at different times. I think for me, there was an interest, and I did find out some details about Daisy's life prior to me, and some of which I haven't put in the book because I think they're very personal to her and her family. But it was clear to me that she'd had quite a tragic life in many respects, and with grief and bereavement, and that perhaps that sort of fed into her being more compassionate than some of her other peer group.
Yeah, but as you said, she wasn't this sort of, she was a reserved, a British lady of a certain age. It wasn't the Hallmark movie king, because he just wasn't done in the 50s and 60s. What to say, no. Let's have a group hug. It just wasn't done.
No group hug. And in fact, this is one of the things that quite shocked me, particularly when I went to secondary school and I started going to friends' houses, and I would see, a friend, a very close friend of mine, we're still great friends, would hug and be hugged by her mum or her dad, and I'm sort of thinking, what's that about? Because we didn't do any of that as far as I can recall. So yeah, it was different in that way as well. But having said that, I think, again, there's a class divide there, because I think I don't know, I may be making too many generalizations here, but it feels like my more middle class friends were more demonstrative. But maybe I've got that all skewed, actually, thinking about it. I don't know. I have such a kind of different view of childhood to most people, I think.
But there was one thing, there's two more things, because we're about to run out of time because it's just gone like that. But the music and the reading, the two great escapes of everybody. And, you got me on the reading and got me on the music, because I play awful guitar. But you mentioned all the way through that you sang and you read, and those were two ways of just putting the rest of the world on hold.
Yeah, well, I think particularly, yes, actually, you could divide it and say that the music was putting the rest of the world on hold, and the reading was trying to understand the rest of the world. Because although I was into, like, Agatha Christie, I was also into, Jean-Paul Sartre. So it's like, at a too young an age to really understand.
A little beret and smoking Galois and having conversations.
All of that stuff was incredibly exotic. And I went on to do A-level French because I love the language. I think it's wonderful language, very expressive. But I was also reading James Baldwin and Richard Wright, who are African-American writers in the 50s and 60s, who were explaining to me about racism, because there was nobody within my group, either adults or children, who could really get to grips with that and explain that to me in a way that made sense. Although I was experiencing it with people spitting at me and all the slogans written on the walls, and the abuse that I would get from people in the street. So I knew it was there, but I didn't know what it was about, why it was there, how it came to be. And I had to look at that stage to Black America for some explanations.
But can you? And I've only got 2 minutes, and damn, but because you can, the civil rights movement in the US is thankfully, and this is obviously from somebody who's born in '68, so doesn't know what he's talking about, but it's perhaps a little bit different from the Afro-Caribbean stroke, African British experience than the Jim Crow rules in the States.
Very, very different, but not absent.
Right.
So they, as you would expect, they played out in different ways because we're different cultures. and it may not have been so obvious, but there were also killings of black people due to their race.
What are you hoping? You know, you love literature and you write your own book. So what are you hoping? And I've got 1 minute and 40, Lola. So here we go. What are you hoping that people are going to take from 8 weeks?
Well, I think that there's lots of things for different people to take. I'm in a rush now. You got me under pressure. One is to think about the circumstances in which children in the care system are brought up and leave that system, and what more can we do to raise general public awareness and more political awareness of what needs to be done in conjunction with those young people. The other is to say, yes, reading, music, the arts, absolutely critical, not just the icing on top of the cake, but absolutely critical to our well-being and sense of who we are and expressing that. I think those are the main things. Oh, the other thing is to say that we shouldn't always look at the 50s and the 60s through these rose-tinted spectacles.
Absolutely.
Of, peace, love, happiness, Great Britain, blah, blah, blah. It was not like that.
Yeah, I always like that when people say, "Oh, it's 60s and it was love in Carnaby Street." It's like, well, no, because my family come from Stoke-on-Trent and Stafford, so it was a little bit different in the West Midlands than it was perhaps if you remember the Rolling Stones.
Slightly, and also class difference.
Yeah,
and very much a kind of racial difference, because that was peak, race.
You're not proud. Yeah, streets. Yeah. I'm going to run out of time. If people want to find you online, Lola, Baroness Young, where's the best place to find you?
Well, actually, anybody can make initial contact through the House of Lords, because all of our email addresses in Parliament are in the public domain. And then if it's non-parliamentary, I can shift to another.
I'm going to crash the news. Thank you so much for your time today.